Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling, well, a true giant of a topic, one of these massive, sprawling subjects that we try to make sense of. We're talking about the United Nations.
It really is the foundational effort of modern international governance. You have this organization that's tasked with, nothing less than keeping global peace.
Right. Global peace, security, human rights.
And it has to do that across 193 member states. So for most people, it's just this vast, complex thing that's kind of operating in the shadows.
Yeah. And it's hard to get a clear view. Is it this brilliant success story, or is it just this, inevitable bureaucracy that's always on the verge of paralysis? So that's really the heart of our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack that origin story. We'll dissect the inner machinery of it all.
Because the names of the different organs really do matter.
They really do. And then we have to critically assess where it succeeded, where it has failed, sometimes catastrophically, and, crucially, the immediate existential challenges it's facing right now.
And when we talk about that mission, we're really talking about the UN Charter. It was signed back on June 26, 1945, and it came into force that October.
And the mission statement itself is just so comprehensive.
Oh, it is. It's maintaining international peace and security, developing friendly relations, promoting cooperation on global problems.
And sort of being the center for harmonizing what all these different countries are doing.
Exactly.
And the scale is it's immense. You said it, 193 member states. That's basically every sovereign state on Earth.
Plus 2 observer states, the Holy See and Palestine, who, they participate in the global conversation.
Right. And what's fascinating to me is the physical presence. The headquarters is in New York City, but it's in this international zone.
Which is such a key detail. That little patch of land is technically international territory, which is absolutely essential for diplomatic neutrality.
But it's not all in New York.
Yeah.
The organization is really decentralized.
It is, yeah. You've got major offices in Geneva, Nairobi, Vienna, and The Hague.
That's where the World Court is, right? The International Court of Justice. It's the only main organ not in New York.
That's the one. And, for anyone who works in this field, it's worth noting the 6 official languages.
Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish.
And those languages, they're a direct reflection of the organization's original power structure and its global reach.
You mentioned neutrality, and that's guarded by a really crucial diplomatic tool.
It is. The UN and all its agencies, they're granted immunity from the laws of the host countries where they operate.
Aye.
It's all based on this Convention on Privileges and Immunities. Without it, they couldn't operate freely in politically sensitive areas. They'd just risk local interference constantly.
So our goal today is to give you clarity on this entire system. We're going to trace it all the way back to the failure of its predecessor.
The League of Nations.
Exactly. Then walk through the power mechanics of the Security Council versus the General Assembly, highlight its, monumental life-saving achievements.
And there are many.
But then we have to zero in on the really scathing criticisms and this profound financial crisis that, it threatens its very survival today.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this journey, because the UN didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was, like you said, built from the ashes of a colossal failure. The League of Nations.
That is the critical starting point. The League was, the first serious, large-scale attempt at a global body for collective security.
And this was right after World War I.
Exactly. Formally set up on January 10th, 1920. And it was championed really passionately by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. He saw it as the ultimate way to prevent another world war.
But the deep irony, of course, is that the U.S. never even joined.
Never joined. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, so the very country that helped create it was never a member.
And that, combined with its other weaknesses, just created these fatal flaws that became so obvious in the 1930s.
Right, when the world needed it most.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The League just lacked any real enforcement power. It relied completely on voluntary collective security and moral persuasion.
Which doesn't work so well against aggressive totalitarian states.
Proved totally useless. Take the 1933 Japanese invasion of Manchuria. The League did what it could do procedurally. 40 nations voted for Japan to withdraw.
And Japan's response?
Their response was to just veto the action and walk out of the League. That was it. The organization had no way to compel them to do anything.
And the failure with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia was, arguably even more humiliating.
It was devastating. This was 1936. Italy, under Mussolini, invades Ethiopia, and Emperor Haile Selassie personally travels to Geneva. He appeals to the League for help.
And he gave that famous speech.
That famous speech where he told the delegates, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow," and the League, they passed some minor ineffective sanctions.
But didn't enforce them.
They didn't enforce them seriously. They were afraid of a wider war, so Italy, sensing that, just walked out of the League too.
So by 1939, when World War II breaks out, the League is effectively dead. And the architects of the UN, they knew that this new organization, it had to have real teeth. It couldn't just rely on goodwill.
And they started planning fast. Even before the U.S. was officially in World War II, early concepts pop up in 1941.
Right, the Declaration of St. James's Palace, the Atlantic Charter.
Yes, with Roosevelt and Churchill. These documents were setting the moral goals for the post-war world. You know, free trade, self-determination, a better security system.
And here's a fun detail. The actual name, United Nations, was coined by Franklin Roosevelt.
It was. He used it to describe the Allied countries fighting the Axis. Churchill accepted it, but he pointed out that Lord Byron had actually used the term in poetry centuries earlier.
That's fascinating. And that name, it quickly became a political concept centered on the Big Four.
The U.S., the U.K., the Soviet Union, and China, they were going to be the central pillars of this new system. And they formalized that with the Declaration by United Nations in January 1942.
And that set a condition for joining, right?
It did. To join the alliance, you had to sign this declaration and declare war on the Axis. It was a wartime coalition, first and foremost.
So they were building the structure of the post-war world during the war. The great powers were already divvying up their future roles.
Exactly right. The formal structuring happened over a few key conferences. First was the Moscow Conference in '43. That was the first public announcement that a new organization would replace the League.
And then Dumbarton Oaks.
Dumbarton Oaks in 1944. That's where the Big Four basically mapped out the whole thing. They agreed on the structure, the function, the Security Council, the General Assembly.
Which all culminated in the big conference in San Francisco in April 1945.
Yeah, the UN Conference on International Organization. You had representatives from 50 nations show up, and this was complex.
Because the Big Four had the blueprint, but they needed everyone else to buy in?
They needed buy-in from all the smaller nations, so that's where the UN Charter was drafted and finally signed on June 26, 1945.
And Poland was added later, bringing the original total to 51 founding members.
The UN officially came into existence on October 24th, 1945, once the charter was ratified by the 5 permanent members and a majority of the other nations.
And they didn't ease into it. They hit the ground running.
They had to. The first General Assembly and Security Council meetings were in London in January 1946. And right away, they're tackling these incredibly tense pre-Cold War issues.
Like Russian troops in Iran and British forces in Greece.
Exactly. The very first moments of the UN were spent trying to mediate the exact conflicts it was designed to prevent.
Okay, so now we get to the structure. This is where the complexity starts, but it's also where you can see the political reality of the world order just baked right into the system.
It's a huge, sprawling system. The Charter established 5 main active organs. You've got the General Assembly, the Security Council, ECOSUS, the ICJ, and the Secretariat.
Plus the Trusteeship Council, which is now inactive.
Right. It did its job on decolonization and suspended operations in 1994.
So let's start with the first one, the most democratic sounding one. The General Assembly, the GA.
You can think of it as the global town hall. It's the main deliberative body. All 193 member states are in it. And here's the key democratic idea. Each state gets 1 vote.
One single vote. So on paper, a tiny island nation has the same voting power as the United States.
On paper, yes. It's pure democracy in that sense.
On paper, yes. It's pure democracy in that sense.
But how powerful are those votes really if they're just recommendations?
And that's the absolute crux of the GA's power dilemma. Now, decisions on really big questions, peace and security, new members, and most critically, the budget, those require a 2/3 majority.
Okay.
But, and this is the vital caveat, outside of its own budget and internal operations, the resolutions passed by the General Assembly are non-binding. They are recommendations.
So they represent the moral weight of the world, but they don't carry any legal obligation.
Precisely. They represent a global consensus.
So if they aren't legally binding, why do the great powers still care so much about what happens in the GA? Because of that moral weight and the legitimacy it confers. A resolution that passes with, 180 votes, that sends a powerful signal. It forces powerful states to explain themselves on the world stage.
And you mentioned the budget. The GA holds the purse strings.
The ultimate power, that's right.
Okay, so how does the actual work get done in this massive body? It can't just be 193 countries shouting in a room.
No, it's all done through a very specific committee structure. Draft resolutions get sent through one of 6 main committees.
For example.
Well, the first committee deals with disarmament and international security. The 4th committee is on decolonization. The 6th handles legal matters.
You said the real institutional power is in the budget.
Yes. So you have to look at the 5th committee, administrative and budgetary issues. This is where the power dynamic really shifts. Because while the GA's political resolutions might be non-binding, the decisions made by the 5th committee on the budget, on the staffing, on how much each country pays, those are absolutely binding on all member states.
So the smaller and developing nations who have a majority in the GA can use the budget to exert real control.
That's exactly it. They can control the UN's physical capacity and its priorities through the administrative minutiae.
Okay, so if the General Assembly is the town hall, we have to talk about the enforcement room, the body with the actual teeth, the Security Council.
This is a completely different animal. It reflects the military power of 1945, not the demographics of today. The Security Council is the UN's enforcer.
The only body that can make legally binding decisions.
The only one. Its resolutions on international peace and security are legally binding on all member states. That's under Article 25 of the Charter. And that mandatory power is what separates the UN from the old League of Nations.
And its composition is just the clearest possible snapshot of who won World War II.
It is. It has 15 members. 5 of them are the permanent members, the P5.
China, France, Russia, the UK, and the United States.
And they hold the famous veto power, meaning any single one of them can block any substantive resolution no matter what the other 14 members want.
And that veto is the single most criticized part of the entire structure. How can the UN claim to promote stability when 5 nations can just unilaterally block action on, say, a humanitarian crisis?
This is where you have to switch from thinking about idealism to thinking about realpolitik. The veto isn't designed to be democratic. It's designed to ensure the UN's survival.
That is to do that.
The people who wrote the charter, they remembered the League collapsing when major powers just walked out. They knew this new system had to keep all the great powers inside the tent. The veto is the price of their participation. It's the guarantee that says, we will allow the UN to function, but never against our own vital national interests.
So it prevents the UN from becoming a tool of one power bloc against another, but the cost is often paralysis.
That is the trade-off, exactly.
What about the other 10 members?
The other 10 are non-permanent members. They serve 2-year terms, and they're elected by the General Assembly on a regional basis to provide, some geographic representation.
But their influence is always limited by that veto threat.
Always.
Okay, moving from the decision makers to the organizational backbone. Let's talk about the engine room, the Secretariat.
The Secretariat is the civil service of the UN. It does all the essential day-to-day work needed to run this massive global system. Tens of thousands of international staff.
The people organizing conferences, translating documents, writing reports from the field.
All of that. And the global face of this entire system is the Secretary General, the SG, currently Antonio Guterres.
And what defines that role today? Is it just being the chief administrator?
Well, the Charter defines the SG as the Chief Administrative Officer, but the job has evolved dramatically. It's really a dual role now. Administrator, yes, but also a top-tier diplomat and mediator in international disputes.
And that comes from Article 99 of the Charter, right?
Yeah.
The part that lets the SG bring threats to the Security Council's attention.
That's the source of their independent political power. But it's an incredibly precarious position to be in.
We've seen some historical examples of that pressure.
We have. Trygve Lie of Norway, the very first SG, was essentially forced out. The Soviet Union just refused to acknowledge him anymore because he supported the UN action in the Korean War. The Cold War pressure was just too much.
But on the other hand, you have figures who dramatically expanded the role.
Oh, yes. Dag Hammarskjöld of Sweden, who served from 1953 until he tragically died in a plane crash in 1961. He is the one who is often seen as defining the modern proactive Secretary General.
The secular monk.
Yes. He pursued this quiet, intense diplomacy, especially during the Suez Crisis and the Congo Crisis. He was willing to personally insert himself into these disputes, and that elevated the role from just administration to high-stakes mediation.
Okay, from the administrative to the judicial. Let's go to The Hague and talk about the International Court of Justice, the World Court.
The ICJ. It's the UN's principal judicial organ, and as you said, it's the only one of the 6 main organs that's not in New York. It's in the Peace Palace in The Hague.
And what kind of cases does it hear? What's its jurisdiction?
Its main job is to adjudicate disputes between nations, not individuals, not corporations. This can be anything from border disputes and treaty interpretations to allegations of state-sponsored war crimes or genocide.
And are its rulings binding?
They are, but, and it's a big but, only on the parties that have specifically agreed to accept the court's jurisdiction on that particular case. The court is made up of 15 judges from different nations.
Okay, we've covered the political, administrative, and judicial branches. Now we have to look at this immense network that deals with global economic and social issues. And that starts with ECOSOC.
The Economic and Social Council, yes. This is the UN's largest and probably most complex body. Its job is to promote international economic and social cooperation. Think of it as the central nervous system for all the UN's development work.
It gathers data, it makes recommendations, and critically, it coordinates all those other agencies.
It coordinates that vast alphabet soup of global organizations.
Let's try to clarify that alphabet soup, because it's confusing. There's a difference between the independent specialized agencies and the UN's own funds and programs.
This is a really crucial distinction to understand how the UN actually works and spends money. ECOSOC is like the traffic controller. The specialized agencies like the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, the WHO, they are autonomous.
So they existed separately.
Many of them did, yes. They were set up by separate treaties, they have their own budgets, their own rules, but they agreed to coordinate their work with the UN through ECOSOC.
And the funds and programs.
Those are different. They were created by and are governed by the General Assembly. So you're talking about the UNDP, the Development Program, UNICEF, the Children's Fund, the WFP, the World Food Program, UNHCR for refugees.
And they are directly accountable to the GA.
Yes, but here's the critical part. They're funded almost entirely by voluntary contributions from member states, not the main UN budget.
Which makes them incredibly vital for humanitarian work, but also really vulnerable to political pressure and funding shortfalls.
Extremely vulnerable.
It must be a huge challenge to staff this entire global system to make sure you're getting top talent from everywhere without just hiring from the richest countries.
That's managed by a governance mechanism called the Noble Mayor Principle. All the UN system organizations follow it.
And what's the goal of that principle?
The goal is equal pay for work of equal value, no matter your nationality. It's essential for creating a truly international civil service.
So how does it actually work for setting salaries?
The principle basically says that salaries have to be competitive enough to attract and retain citizens from the countries where civil service pay is highest. Historically, that's been the United States Federal Civil Service.
So it ensures a professional workforce, but I can see how critics would point to that as creating a kind of isolated, well-paid international elite.
That is one of the complex implications, yes.
Okay, let's move on to what the UN actually does, the core work. We can break it down into 3 big areas: peace, rights, and development. Let's start with peacekeeping. The Blue Helmets.
Peacekeeping is one of the UN's most visible and most controversial security tools. It's important to remember the UN does not have a standing army.
Right.
These forces are voluntary contributions. Troops, police, military observers that member states offer up, and they're deployed by the Security Council to enforce peace agreements or protect civilians in post-conflict zones.
There's a RAND Corporation study that said UN peacekeeping is successful in 2/3 of its efforts, which sounds good, but how do we square that with the catastrophic failures, like in Rwanda, that led to worldwide ridicule?
That's the central paradox of peacekeeping. The massive failures are often political failures of the Security Council. A failure to grant the right mandate or provide the resources, or just a lack of political will for the troops to actually intervene.
So where the mandate is clear and the resources are there, it tends to work.
The study suggests that yes, UN-led nation-building efforts generally result in a more durable peace than when a single country goes in alone.
What makes it different? What makes it more effective in those cases?
It comes down to legitimacy and soft power. A Georgetown professor, Lise Howard, she notes that the UN's approach is fundamentally non-offensive. The Blue Helmets are there to deter, not to wage war.
So they're using things other than force.
Mostly, yes. Verbal persuasion, financial inducements, and coercion short of offensive military force. And because the forces are multinational, mandated by this global body, they just carry a higher degree of international legitimacy. It's easier for them to gain the trust of local factions.
And beyond putting boots on the ground, the UN is also a huge player in preventing conflict through arms limitation treaties.
Oh, an indispensable player. That was written into the charter from day one. And then when nuclear weapons were developed just weeks later, it became an overwhelming priority. The very first resolution of the First General Assembly called for eliminating atomic weapons.
What are some of the biggest treaty milestones that just wouldn't have happened without the UN providing that forum?
Well, the entire global nuclear architecture, really. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, is the big one. Then you have the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the treaty banning landmines.
And UN-associated bodies like the IAEA oversee all of this?
Yes, the IAEA, the OPCW, they oversee the practical application of these incredibly complex agreements.
Okay, let's shift to human rights. This feels like the more foundation of the whole post-war mission.
It is. And the cornerstone document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, adopted in 1948. It was drafted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt.
Now, it's important to understand the hierarchy here. The UDHR itself isn't legally binding, is it?
No, it's not. It's a common standard of achievement. It's a philosophical blueprint.
But that philosophy was then turned into actual binding law.
Correct. The UDHR is the foundation for two legally binding treaties, or covenants. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. These are what turn the moral principles into legal obligations for the states that ratify them.
And that mandate has kept evolving over time, reflecting how global awareness changes.
Absolutely. We've seen key conventions targeting specific groups: CEDAW in 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989.
And more recently?
More recently, in 2011, the General Assembly passed a landmark resolution recognizing the rights of members of the LGBTQ+ community. So the UN is constantly trying to push the boundaries of what counts as a globally accepted human right.
Moving to economic development and crisis response, this is often the most visible work the UN does on the ground, literally saving lives.
And the operational scale here is just staggering. The UN sets these global benchmarks for progress. They started with the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, from 2000 to 2015.
And now we have the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Exactly. The SDGs are much broader. They cover poverty, education, climate action, equality. It's a huge agenda.
And in terms of specific diseases, they have a track record that proves international cooperation can work.
It really can. I mean, the WHO announced the global eradication of smallpox in 1980. That is arguably the single greatest public health achievement in human history.
And they've worked on polio, leprosy.
And UNAIDS coordinates the global response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The UN Population Fund is the largest source of funding for reproductive health and family planning in the world.
And when a conflict or a natural disaster hits, the UN's humanitarian logistics capacity is just unmatched.
The intensity is hard to overstate. Just take the World Food Program, the WFP. They feed, on average, 90 million people a year in 80 countries. That requires these massive, complex logistical chains that often have to operate in war zones.
And at the same time, the UNHCR is protecting refugees globally.
Providing aid and legal frameworks for millions of people who have lost everything.
And finally, we've seen the UN push new issues onto the global agenda, like the environment and technology.
That focus really took hold with the UN Environmental Program, UNP, back in 1972. And a key outcome of that was the establishment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 1988.
And the IPCC is crucial because it doesn't make policy itself.
No, it synthesizes and assesses the science. It creates this unified, consensus-based voice on climate change that governments all over the world rely on.
And now a very modern focus is emerging in the digital space, looking at things like AI governance.
Yes, the UN has started organizing an annual open source week. It's an attempt to foster collaboration on everything from tech projects to creating global policies for artificial intelligence before the tech just completely outpaces regulation.
Okay. Here's where we have to balance the ledger. Because for every success story, every life saved by the WFP, there's a litany of intense criticism and historical failure. And this takes us right to the existential challenges the UN faces.
The organization was, it was essentially paralyzed for its first 40 years by the Cold War. The US and the Soviets just vetoed each other constantly.
But even after the Cold War ended, the UN faced these defining crises that showed its limits, when the P5 just couldn't agree to act.
And we have spent some time on these mission failures because they define so much of the criticism today.
They absolutely do.
The UN mission in Somalia, for instance, it ended in what was widely seen as a failure, especially after the U.S. pulled out after the Battle of Mogadishu in '93.
And the mission in Bosnia faced worldwide ridicule.
Complete ridicule. The UN declared these safe zones, but it had no capacity and no authorization to actually defend them. So you had horrific events like the Srebrenica massacre happening right under the UN's nose.
But the most enduring stain on the UN's moral authority has to be the failure to intervene in the 1994 Rwandan genocide.
That is the ultimate tragic example of paralysis by the Security Council. The commander of the UN mission there, General Romeo Dallaire, he repeatedly sent cables to New York. He was begging for permission and reinforcements to seize arms caches and stop the violence he knew was coming.
And the Security Council just refused.
They refused. They lacked the political consensus. They were unwilling to authorize a robust mandate. And the result was the slaughter of up to 1 million people in 100 days. It proved that the UN's protective power is only as strong as the political will of the P5.
And these failures, they feed directly into the deep-seated structural critiques. And the biggest one is that veto power.
Critics argue correctly that the veto is just fundamentally undemocratic. Even former President Obama noted that divisions in the Security Council continue to hamstring the UN's ability to act. It allows national interest to just trump collective security every time.
And that fuels a broader geopolitical divide, what people call the North-South split.
Which is really a philosophical conflict. It's the richer northern nations, the G7 bloc, versus the developing southern nations, organized in the Group of 77, which is now 133 countries.
And the G77 wants a more empowered General Assembly.
They do. They argue that if the GA represents the world's population, one nation, one vote, why should the Security Council, which represents historical power, hold all the legally binding authority?
While the North wants to keep the UN's role limited to just transnational threats like terrorism, things they can't handle alone.
That's the core tension. The South wants democratization. The North defends the existing power structure.
We also see critiques about exclusion and bias. The exclusion of Taiwan is a long-standing issue.
It is. It goes back to a 1971 General Assembly resolution that recognized the People's Republic of China, the PRC, over the Republic of China, Taiwan, as the only legitimate representatives of China.
And that resolution still blocks Taiwan's inclusion in agencies like the WHO.
It does. Critics say this hurts global health, which became really obvious during the pandemic. But the political pressure from the PRC ensures that support for Taiwan's inclusion is always blocked.
And on the topic of bias, there is constant, highly charged criticism about the UN's focus on the Middle East.
This is a very sensitive issue. Critics, especially pro-Israeli groups and some diplomats, allege a pro-Palestinian bias, particularly in bodies like the UN Human Rights Council,
Which has singled out Israel far more than other countries.
Yes. And that critique is often used by politicians, particularly in the U.S., to question the organization's overall impartiality.
And beyond bias, there are these fundamental arguments about whether the UN is a threat to national sovereignty.
This has been a recurring theme in conservative politics in the U.S. since the very beginning. The argument is that these multilateral agreements on things like the environment or human rights, they erode a nation's ability to govern itself.
And it's not just talk. We see actual legislation being introduced.
All the time. The American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which would pull the U.S. out of the UN entirely, has been introduced in Congress multiple times as recently as 2022.
And it's trickled down to the state level.
It has. In 2023, Tennessee passed a law that explicitly blocks the implementation of any programs originating in or traceable to the United Nations, specifically citing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
So these external challenges are then compounded by systemic internal problems: inefficiency, mismanagement.
Bureaucratic waste has been a consistent complaint from the major donor countries, and in response, they've created internal watchdogs like the Office of Internal Oversight Services, OIOS.
But those are created because of pressure, right?
Yes. The U.S. Congress repeatedly withheld its dues in the 1990s, specifically to force the UN to reform itself internally.
And we can't talk about internal failure without mentioning the massive corruption scandal of the Oil for Food program.
That was a devastating blow to the UN's reputation. The program was supposed to let Iraq, which was under sanctions, sell oil in exchange for humanitarian supplies.
But the investigation found
It found widespread systemic fraud, billions of dollars in kickbacks. UN officials, diplomats, contractors were all implicated. It raised really serious questions about the integrity of the whole organization.
And the blue helmets, who are supposed to represent the UN's moral authority, have themselves been implicated in horrific misconduct.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Peacekeepers have faced widespread accusations of sexual exploitation and abuse, even child rape in missions in the Congo, Liberia, Sudan.
And there was the cholera outbreak in Haiti.
A devastating public health failure. Scientists traced the 2010s Haiti cholera outbreak, which killed over 8,000 people, back to UN peacekeepers from Nepal.
So on top of all the structural flaws, the political paralysis, the internal scandals, the UN is now facing a severe, acute financial crisis.
This is an immediate and critical threat. The situation has gotten really severe since 2020. The UN is facing a liquidity crisis because member states are delaying or just refusing to pay their assessed contributions.
And who are the main players in this?
Well, the United States is the single largest contributor. It's assessed at 22% of the regular budget and about 27% of peacekeeping costs.
But a U.S. law from 1994 limits the country to paying no more than 25% for peacekeeping,
which creates an automatic shortfall. But more strategically, both the U.S. and China, who is the second largest contributor, they often delay their payments as a direct political tactic.
You're saying they're using the money they owe as leverage?
That's the assessment from diplomats. They leverage payment delays to influence the UN on major political issues. China on the persecution of the Uyghurs, or the U.S. on the UN's stance on the Gaza war. It's a tool of obstruction.
And the stakes are incredibly high right now. What's the real impact of this shortfall?
The impact is measured in human lives. As of May 2025, only 61 countries had paid their dues in full. The shortfall is forcing massive budget cuts, and the UN has warned that millions of lives that rely on programs like the World Food Program are being put at risk.
Because the political maneuvering of a few powerful states is undermining the entire humanitarian mandate.
It fundamentally does.
And yet, despite this staggering list of failures and criticisms, the organization's achievements can't be ignored.
Absolutely not. I mean, the UN and its agencies have been recognized with numerous Nobel Peace Prizes, which confirms the tangible, positive impact they've had.
Dag Hammarskjöld and Kofi Annan both received the prize, and the UN as a whole shared it with Annan in 2001.
Right, and individual negotiators like Rolf Bunch and Lester B. Pearson for organizing the very first peacekeeping force during the Suez Crisis.
And the humanitarian agencies themselves have a huge honors role.
They do. UNICEF for its work with children, the UNHCR, which has won twice for refugee protection, the IAEA for nuclear safeguards, and the World Food Program for fighting hunger. They've all been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
So what does this all mean? When we look back over these first 8 decades, how do we sum up this complex, contradictory legacy?
The historian Paul Kennedy concluded that while the organization has had some major setbacks, when all its aspects are considered, the UN has brought great benefits to our generation and will bring benefits to our children's and grandchildren's generations as well.
And that quote from President Eisenhower in 1953, it sort of puts the dichotomy perfectly. He acknowledged all the flaws, but said that the United Nations represents man's best organized hope to substitute the conference table for the battlefield.
And the author Stanley Meisler, I think he summarized it perfectly. He said the UN never fulfilled the maximalist, idealistic hopes of its founders, but it accomplished a great deal nonetheless. It's this necessary, flawed institution that acts as the world's safety valve and conscience.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Considering the current financial crisis, driven by powerful member states withholding their dues for political leverage, and these deep debates over sovereignty versus global governance, what immediate non-structural change could the UN implement to insulate its most critical, life-saving humanitarian operations, like the World Food Program and UNICEF, from the political paralysis and the funding demands of the Security Council's permanent members? Is there a governance or financial mechanism that could allow saving lives to become truly apolitical?
Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are wrestling with the enduring paradox of the United Nations. It was established back in 1945 with this foundational belief that collective action could prevent another global catastrophe. And its primary mandate, right there in the charter, is the maintenance of international peace and security. But its legacy is, well, it's profoundly contradictory. You have these amazing successes in social progress and humanitarian work right alongside, trenchant criticisms of ineffectiveness and political bias in its security role.
It really is the ultimate global organization, isn't it? I mean, with 193 member states, and that tension you're talking about between the aspiration and the political reality, that's precisely what defines its effectiveness, or in many cases, its lack thereof.
And I come at it from a different perspective. I'll be arguing that the organization's true, lasting impact is actually found in its secondary goals, social and economic cooperation. We have to assess the UN on the tangible, systemic improvements it delivers across the globe, achievements that are often secured in spite of the political gridlock that paralyzes its main security function. So for me, the premise of the UN Charter is just non-negotiable. It's collective security. The system was explicitly designed so that if a nation commits aggression, the international community, led by the Security Council, acts decisively. Now, if that system can't prevent the mass slaughter of civilians or stop one nation from invading another, then the resulting humanitarian suffering, it just negates any of the good works that come after. The material shows how the system was almost immediately, hobbled. During the Cold War, that division between the US and the USSR often paralyzed the organization, allowing it to intervene only in conflicts distant from the Cold War. And the veto power, held by the 5 permanent members, it's a core feature, but one that's often described as fundamentally undemocratic, and crucially, a main cause of inaction on genocides and crimes against humanity. When you look at the historical record, the failures they're catastrophic. The organization was paralyzed during the Bangladeshi genocide in 1971, the Cambodian genocide in the 70s, and of course, most notoriously, the Rwandan genocide in 1994. These aren't, minor policy failures. They represent a complete breakdown of the UN's core function. If the UN can't prevent the worst horrors imaginable, its other important work just becomes a very expensive attempt to mitigate the consequences of its own political impotence.
I absolutely acknowledge that the Security Council is severely constrained. It's constrained by the political interests of its member states, especially, of course, those with the veto. That's an inherent structural limitation, maybe even an intended feature of a body that requires the participation of the great powers to even exist. But judging the UN solely on its constrained political wing, it ignores the operational reality of the system for the last, 70 years? There was a real functional shift in focus and resources. By the 1970s, the budget for social and economic development was already far greater than its peacekeeping budget. That right there demonstrates where the most consistent effort and cooperation have been directed. And the UN system has been repeatedly recognized as a leader in human development. This isn't just theory. It's evidenced by Nobel Peace Prizes given specifically to its agencies like UNICEF in 1965, or the International Labor Organization, the ILO, in 1969. But more importantly, just consider the concrete outcomes. The eradication of smallpox by the World Health Organization in 1980. That's arguably one of the greatest public health achievements in human history. The Millennium and Sustainable Development Goals, the MDGs and SDGs, have completely shifted the global conversation on poverty and health. And when conflict does happen, you have organizations like the World Food Program feeding, on average, 90 million people in 80 nations every single year. These are life-saving systemic successes on a massive scale. That, I argue, is where you find its true effectiveness.
That is a powerful list of achievements. And look, no one disputes the life-saving work of the WFP or the WHO. But the scale of that development aid, however vast, it can't fundamentally excuse the failures of the Security Council. Those failures directly lead to the need for the humanitarian response. The two are inextricably linked. If you eliminate the primary cause of suffering, which is conflict, that secondary aid becomes far less necessary. The material points to instances where the security mandate wasn't just inactive, it was actively tested and found wanting. Take the mission in Bosnia. The UN faced worldwide ridicule for its indecisive, confused mission in the face of ethnic cleansing, specifically the failure to protect designated safe areas. Or, more recently, during the Rwandan civil war in 2009, an internal review concluded the organization suffered a systemic failure. These are failures of the highest moral and operational order. The inability to prevent aggression creates the very humanitarian catastrophes, mass starvation, refugee crises, that the development agencies then have to frantically try to mitigate. I find it very difficult to call the UN effective when it fails at prevention, thereby ensuring the need for these incredibly expensive and dangerous mitigation efforts.
Right. I understand the moral argument that prevention is better than a cure, but we're arguing about how to define success in what is, by design, a structurally flawed organization. You're defining success purely by prevention, which is a metric that requires full consensus among five great powers who are often fundamentally opposed. I'm defining it by tangible, measured achievement and mitigation, which the UN manages to do continuously. And, the narrative of universal political impotence is maybe a bit too simplistic. The data complicates that. A Rand Corporation study in 2005 actually found the UN was successful in 2/3 of its peacekeeping efforts. And political scientists later determined that UN operations are demonstrably more effective at reducing civilian casualties than counterterrorism operations by nation-states. So even in that incredibly difficult domain of security, the UN prevents bloodshed more effectively than many alternatives. But let's go back to the sheer scale. The UN apparatus that's dedicated to human welfare, from the UNDP publishing the Human Development Index to UNFPA funding reproductive health, it operates on a continuous loop of global improvement. This continuous, profound impact is the UN's most steady success. And it's achieved because these agencies are often designed to function outside the political machinery of the Council.
Okay, but that brings us to a really fundamental tension then. If the development apparatus works so well because it's separate from the Security Council, doesn't that fundamentally argue for a complete divorce? Because the structural problems in the Council are not only impeding peace, they're now actively threatening the financial stability of the very humanitarian agencies you're championing. I'm talking specifically about the system's new vulnerability. The material discusses this 2025 financial crisis, which is caused by member states delaying their payments. Major contributors like the US and China, they delay their payments in order to influence the UN on topics such as the Gaza war and persecution of Uyghurs in China. This proves that political interests are consistently paralyzing administrative effectiveness and, critically, risking putting millions of lives at risk. Your whole argument hinges on the effectiveness of these agencies. But their funding, their very lifeblood, is perpetually a political hostage to great power dysfunction. How can we call that branch effective when its operation is constantly being leveraged?
That is a sharp point, and the financial vulnerability of the system is it's undeniable. It really highlights that no international organization is immune from the political whims of its most powerful members. But consider the alternative. The UN was created to replace the failed League of Nations, a body that collapsed because great powers just refused to participate. The US never joined, and the League was useless against Japan or Italy. The current UN structure, however flawed, and yes, the veto is the primary flaw, it at least ensures communication and participation among the great powers. That's a necessary, if often frustrating, prerequisite for global stability. President Eisenhower famously said the UN represents man's best organized hope to substitute the conference table for the battlefield. The structure, while imperfect, provides that mechanism for de-escalation that the League never had. And beyond that, the Charter provides a foundation beyond just state sovereignty. It mandates the promotion of respect for human rights. Now, the Security Council can't always enforce this, but the very existence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a foundational norm the UN established, it sets the essential common standard. And that standard shapes diplomacy, law, and eventually the humanitarian work you're worried about. That norm-setting power is a crucial long-term success that operates despite all the political wrangling over budgets.
I agree, the norm setting is vital. But norms are meaningless without integrity. And we have to address the severe ethical failures that compromise the integrity of the operations themselves. These failures directly undermine the reputation of the humanitarian work we're trying to assess. The organization has faced chronic criticism for mismanagement and corruption, which, it prompted the U.S. to withdraw UNESCO funding way back in 1984. But the issue is far more grave than just inefficiency. Peacekeeping missions, the very missions meant to stabilize conflict zones, have been marred by deeply serious accusations. UN peacekeepers accused of child rape, of soliciting prostitutes, of widespread sexual abuse in places like the DRC, Haiti, and Sudan. And beyond that, scientists actually cited UN peacekeepers from Nepal as the source of the 2010s Haiti cholera outbreak, which killed thousands of civilians. When the organization tasked with saving lives is directly responsible for causing mass death and perpetuating ethical horrors, that shifts the failure from a policy limitation to a profound moral crisis. That level of operational failure just poisons the trust you need for any humanitarian work to succeed.
And those ethical and operational disasters, the corruption, the oil for food program, the horrific misconduct by peacekeepers, they are absolute stains on the organization's reputation. They have to be addressed with the gravest seriousness. I agree. However, I think we have to view them as failures of accountability and implementation within specific missions, rather than as a failure of the entire system's effectiveness. The UN isn't immune to reform. These failures are what drive necessary institutional changes, like the significant management reforms started by Boutros Boutros-Ghali and Kofi Annan. And when we look at the entire system, the specialized agencies offer a vital counterpoint. The material notes that these agencies, like the Food and Agriculture Organization and the UNHCR, they operate with almost complete independence. They succeed in their essential functions, promoting agricultural stability, protecting refugees, precisely because their effectiveness is measured by tangible outcomes, by technical expertise. It insulates them from those political constraints. This operational independence ensures that the life-saving work continues, even amidst the dysfunction of the Security Council. If we judge the organization on where its success is most consistent, the balance has to tip toward the welfare agencies.
I see why you emphasize that independence, I do, but I remain unconvinced that the effectiveness of independent parts can redeem the failures of the whole, especially when that whole is so clearly defined by its charter. Conclusion. So, to summarize my position, the assessment of the UN has to remain tethered to its primary mandate, peace and security. When the organization suffers a systemic failure in conflict zones, when the veto ensures paralysis, and great powers use funding as political leverage, the UN is fundamentally unable to address its most critical charter function. All the other development gains are just made vulnerable when the organization cannot prevent mass conflict. Its effectiveness ultimately is measured by its ability to prevent the worst outcomes, not just alleviate them afterwards.
Well, I think complexity like this often requires multiple perspectives to really appreciate the global impact. And while the political and ethical failings in the security apparatus are undeniable, for me, the UN's enduring legacy, its true measure of effectiveness, is found in its vast infrastructure for human rights, economic development, and global health. These secondary objectives, they now represent the majority of the system's work. They offer proof of tangible, sustained global cooperation that saves millions of lives, often succeeding precisely where the political organs are designed to fail. These results are the stable core of the organization's continuous success.
A tension between the UN's structural political limitations and its societal achievements remains central to understanding global governance. It certainly suggests there's much more to explore in the material about how international organizations navigate sovereign interests.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for The Debate.